Honken grew up in Britt, Iowa. His father, Jim Honken, was an alcoholic schemer who was allegedly neglectful. Honken reported in his pre-sentence investigation that his father struck him numerous times during his childhood, although he denied that his father was physically abusive and maintained that the emotional turmoil in his early life mostly stemmed from his father's alcoholism. Jim once convinced his son to steal and copy a key to a bank. Jim committed 2 bank robberies before getting caught and sent to federal prison. Honken's parents divorced when he was 9. Honken had a healthy relationship with his stepfather. Honken had a notably healthy relationship with his mother, who he described as perfect. The movement's mother provided a stable, nurturing, and loving environment, never abandoned him, did not fail to provide any sort of safe space or comfort to him, never neglected him, never failed to calm him or tell him that things were going to be okay, acted as a loving caretaker, and facilitated the movement's attachment to her by making herself available to him. Honken, who was proficient in math, science, and writing, earned a scholarship to North Iowa Area Community College in 1991. He later said that he had initially planned to become a pharmaceutical lawyer. Honken had physically and verbally abused his sister, Alyssa. He once held a pillow over Alyssa's face after she told one of his girlfriends that he had other girlfriends. Alyssa was unable to breathe and was scared that her brother would execute her, but he stopped, apologized, and started crying when he realized what he had done. On another occasion, Honken tried to drown Alyssa in a hotel pool. She could not breathe and swallowed water. Dustin eventually released his sister. In 1984, Honken plotted a bank robbery in which the person he would convince to commit the robbery for him would then be slain and thrown into a pond. In 1986, Honken schemed to assassinate one of his accomplices after stealing a car. Between 1986 and 1989, Honken was involved in a conversation which mentioned the possibility of assassinating his brother's business partner to collect a $1 million life insurance policy. In 1990, Honken violated and threatened his girlfriend. He later threatened to lock her in the basement and wondered how long it would take for her to be found, and how deep someone would need to be buried for them not to be plowed up by farm machinery. It was clear that Honken was a sociopath and had a narcissistic personality disorder. In the early 1990s, Honken started selling marijuana and cocaine. After finishing a year of community college chemistry classes with an A-, Honken decided to become both a drug manufacturer and a dealer using what he had learned. He also decided to switch to meth. Honken enlisted his best friend, Tim Cutcomp, moved to Arizona, and borrowed $5,000 from his brother to buy chemicals and equipment. Within a year, Honken and Cutcomp managed to produce several pounds of nearly pure meth, which they sold in northeast Iowa, primarily through 2 dealers, Terry DeGius and Greg Nicholson. The 2 made hundreds of thousands of dollars from several drug runs. On one of his drug runs, Honken met Angela Johnson, who was then dating DeGius. Johnson told Honken that DeGius was personally using too much meth, which was supposed to be sold, and that they should deal with each other instead. The 2 started a romantic relationship, and Johnson soon became pregnant with Honken's child. Honken, seeking to expand his drug-dealing business, studied chemistry textbooks at the library, read science journals, kept extremely thorough records, made plans to expand his business to the internet, and considered writing his own book about how to make and sell meth in the United States. In March 1993, Honken and Cutcomp were arrested on federal dope trafficking charges. While preparing for his trial, Honken discovered through legal documents that Nicholson had turned witness. He wore a wire to a meeting and recorded Honken making a future $3,000 deal. Authorities had found almost 150 grams of pure meth in Nicholson's house, and he'd agreed to become an informant in exchange for leniency. Over the next few weeks, Nicholson became extremely paranoid. His then-wife, Leslie Olson, said he prevented her from going outside or staying near windows for very long. The 2 ended their relationship shortly after Nicholson's arrest. Honken had threatened Nicholson in the past, saying he could order a hit on him or anyone else if he wanted. Honken said he planned to plead guilty, and a hearing was scheduled for July 30th, 1993. Honken was released on bond and searched for Nicholson's whereabouts. Johnson bought a pistol on July 7th, 1993. The two eventually located Nicholson. On July 24, 1993, Johnson pretended to be a lost saleswoman to get into Nicholson's home, where she and Honken bound him and forced him to record a statement claiming that Honken was innocent. The two then bound and gagged Nicholson and his new girlfriend, 37-year-old Lori Ann Duncan. Johnson took Duncan's daughters, 10-year-old Candace Duncan and 6-year-old Amber Duncan, telling them that they were going on a surprise trip. Honken and Johnson forced the family into a car at gunpoint and drove to a wooded area outside of the city. Honken took the adults out of the car, walked them into the woods, and executed them in front of a pre-dug shallow grave. He then did the same to the children. On July 30th, 1993, Honken gave his attorney the recording and said he was changing his plea. Upon learning that Nicholson had disappeared, the government turned to Honken's former dealer, DeGius. Honken told Cutcomp that he was worried about DeGius turning on him. On November 5th, 1993, DeGius also disappeared. The night before his disappearance, he dropped his 10-year-old daughter off at his mother's house and said he was going to meet Johnson. Johnson lured DeGius to a country club under the guise of wanting to rekindle their relationship, then drove to an abandoned house where Honken was waiting. Honken beat, shot, and buried DeGius. Without any witnesses, the government was forced to drop its case against Honken. In the winter of 1993 or 1994, Honken went to Cutcomp and said he needed to destroy a pistol. The two used a blowtorch to cut and melt the gun into multiple pieces, which they discarded in ditches along a country road. In the fall of 1995, Honken recruited a man named Dan Cobean to help him manufacture meth. However, Cobean became a police informant. On February 7, 1996, officers executed a search warrant on Honken's house and discovered his meth lab, chemicals, equipment, books, and notes, including ones on manufacturing dope and how to bind and gag people. Honken and Cutcomp were indicted on federal drug trafficking charges. While awaiting trial, Honken was released on bond. During this time, he plotted to murder Cobean, police officers, and chemists, and to destroy evidence against him. Cutcomp decided to become an informant. He suspected that Honken had killed Nicholson and was afraid of being wrongfully accused of slaughter. Cutcomp wore a wire while he was around Honken during their time on pretrial release. Cutcomp recorded Honken talking about his plans to kill witnesses and implicitly referenced killing witnesses in 1993. He compared the feeling of executing someone to a football game, saying, "Once you go a certain distance, there ain't no turning back." When Cutcomp asked Honken if slaughtering people bothered him, he replied, "Nope. Never think about it. Never. Never dream about it. Never anything. Thought I'd have nightmares." Honken was recorded calling Cobean a rat and saying he would kill him no matter what. "I've climbed far bigger hills than that little hill. Even if I'm in prison for 15 years, whatever. When I get out, he's still dead." When Cutcomp expressed concern over the homicides, Honken said Cobean forced his hand. "They made me choose between my family and them. I'm sorry, but that ain't no choice." After Cutcomp gave the recordings to federal investigators, Honken's bond was revoked. While in jail, Honken confessed to fellow inmates that he'd killed witnesses from an earlier case. He plotted to murder Cutcomp and gave a fellow inmate directions to Cutcomp's house. Honken conspired with another inmate to escape from jail by breaking a hole in the wall of his cell and having Johnson deliver a hacksaw and a rope. However, the plot was discovered and stopped by guards. For his cooperation, Cutcomp was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison. On June 2, 1997, Honken pleaded guilty to attempting to distribute meth and conspiring to manufacture and distribute meth. He faced a minimum of 10 years in prison. Honken's lawyer, requesting a sentence of 10 to 15 years, attacked the government's handling of the evidence in the case. He also pointed to Honken's youth, saying, "The court needs to consider his age. He can be rehabilitated. This is an intelligent young man." On behalf of the prosecution, Assistant U.S. Attorney argued for a life sentence, spending hours making a case for sentencing enhancements on the grounds that Honken had something to do with the disappearances of Nicholson, Lori, Candace, Amber, and DeGius. "It appears that these people are dead. We believe the defendant was involved in this. We believe that he was ready to take violent actions again. The maximum sentence sends a message to this defendant and other defendants who are thinking about taking things into their own hands, that conduct is unacceptable." U.S. District Judge imposed sentencing enhancements on Honken for attempting to obstruct justice and having a major role in the conspiracy, and granted a deduction for Honken accepting responsibility. However, he declined to rule on whether Honken likely had a role in the 1993 disappearances. Consequently, Honken's offense level under the United States federal sentencing guidelines was set at 38, which called for a sentence of 235 to 293 months in prison. Honken received the maximum sentence. He was also ordered to serve 5 years of supervised release and fined $1,100. Upon hearing the sentence, Honken seemed visibly disappointed. He'd apologized, saying, "I wasn't expecting things to go this way. I let down my family, my children most of all. I wish there was some way to go back and start over, but obviously there isn't." The court resentenced Honken to 27 years in prison, saying the minimum sentence was sufficiently harsh. Referring to the 1993 disappearances, the court said that while the government had made a compelling case for Honken likely being responsible, his view was that if the government believed Honken was an executioner, they should charge him with homicide. While in prison, Honken made plans to escape and then murder witnesses, law enforcement officers, and the federal prosecutor. To prepare for his escape, Honken and fellow inmates practiced retrieving an officer's weapon, learning how to remove handcuffs with minimal tools, and training in martial arts scenarios centering around encounters with an armed escort. Honken was charged with the murders in 2001. The government announced they would seek death sentences for both Honken and Johnson. After a court found that Honken posed an extreme security risk due to his history of escape attempts and threatening witnesses, he was ordered to wear a stun belt and be shackled and bolted to the floor during his trial. To minimize potential prejudice, the court ordered officers not to move Honken in the presence of the jury, and that table skirts be placed on the counsel tables so the jury would be unable to see the shackles. The shackles were fitted with a chain so Honken could move normally without the shackles making noise. Honken and Johnson were tried separately. Honken was tried first, with his trial starting in October 2004. His lawyers pointed to the lack of physical evidence linking him to the homicides. The prosecution said he had every reason to execute the victims and presented 65 witnesses against him. Among them were many of the inmates to whom Honken had confessed, including Fred Tokars. Tokars testified that Honken described strangling Lori Duncan and Greg Nicholson and slaughtered the children since they could have been witnesses. In 2005, Tokars stopped an attempted escape by Honken, in which he plotted to escape with the help of white supremacists and murder witnesses. Ron McIntosh said Honken told him he execute the children since they wouldn't be quiet or wouldn't shut up. Dennis Putzier said Honken had bragged about slaughtering witnesses in 1993. Another inmate said Honken killed rats and children raised by rats. Prosecutors played a tape in which Honken was recorded saying that he liked executing people and compared the feeling to getting high on drugs. During cross-examination, a defense attorney questioned why someone like Honken would confide in a couple of crackheads who steal hogs for a living. They are people who have no future, referring to the inmates. He said Honken was a young man infatuated with drug manufacturing, basically a nerd. On October 27, 2004, jurors recommended life sentences for Honken for killing the adult victims and death sentences for killing the children. He was formally sentenced to death on October 11, 2005. On July 17, 2020, Honken was executed by lethal injection. His final words were a reciting of the poem Heaven Haven by Gerard Manley Hopkins. I have desired to go where springs not fail, to fields where flies no sharp and sided hail, and a few lilies blow. And I have asked to be where no storms come, where the green swell is in the havens dumb, and out of the swing of the sea. Honken then said, Hail Mary, Mother of God, pray for me. He was pronounced dead at 3:36 p.m.